Imagine, if you will, a moonless night in February 1815. The air is thick with the scent of salt and ancient secrets. On a tiny, isolated island in the Mediterranean called Elba, the most dangerous man in the world is missing. For months, the kings and generals of Europe slept soundly in their gilded palaces, believing the ogre of Corsica was finally caged, a broken relic of a fallen empire, destined to be forgotten by time. But as the long shadows lengthened over the jagged cliffs of the coast, a ghost was preparing to walk among the living once more. This is not just a simple story of a prison break. It is a tale of a gamble so audacious, a mystery so deep, and a psychological masterclass so profound that it defies everything we know about power, charisma, and fate. You are about to enter a world of hidden codes, double agents, and a journey through the dark, cold heart of France that no one, absolutely no one, saw coming. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who once held the entire European continent in his iron palm, was now reduced to the emperor of a miniature kingdom. Elba was his cage, a beautiful but cramped prison surrounded by the relentless patrol of British warships and guarded by the watchful, predatory eyes of Colonel Neil Campbell. To the casual observer, Napoleon seemed like a man truly defeated, a spent force spending his days obsessively gardening, organizing small village festivals, and complaining about his shrinking household budget. He looked like a retired soldier fading into obscurity. But beneath this carefully constructed mask of domestic boredom lay a mind that never stopped calculating. He was like a world-class chess grandmaster seeing 50 moves ahead while his opponents were still arguing over the rules. He knew things his captors couldn't possibly imagine. Through a network of secret couriers and coded letters hidden in bread and wine barrels, he knew the French people were growing cold and resentful toward the new king, Louis XVIII. The king had returned like a forgotten, dusty shadow from the past, trying to erase 20 years of revolution. Napoleon also knew that his former enemies, the Allied powers gathered in Vienna, were already tearing each other apart like vultures over the spoils of war. But most importantly, he discovered a fatal human flaw in his prison walls. Colonel Neil Campbell had a profound weakness, a lady friend in the city of Florence, whose company frequently drew him away from his lonely post at the harbor for days at a time. On the night of February 26th, the stars finally aligned for the impossible. While the British Guard was distracted by his personal affairs, the heavy silence of Elba was broken by the soft, rhythmic thud of boots on wooden docks. In total, terrifying secrecy, 1,100 loyal soldiers, hardened men of the old guard, who had survived the frozen, blood-soaked hell of Moscow and the scorching, sun-blinded deserts of Egypt, boarded a small fleet of 7 modest ships. Napoleon himself stepped onto the brig Inconstant. As the sails caught the midnight breeze, they weren't just sailing toward the French coast. They were sailing into a potential death trap. To reach the mainland, they had to navigate the Lion's Den, the Royal Navy, the most powerful and ruthless fleet on Earth. During the crossing, a British patrol ship actually pulled alongside the Inconstant in the dead of night, their lanterns swinging in the fog. The British captain's voice boomed across the black waves, demanding to know the cargo and the health of the exiled emperor. Napoleon, standing just a few feet away in the darkness with his heart hammering against his ribs, ordered his guards to keep their voices steady as they shouted back, "The emperor is doing wonderfully. He is currently asleep." The British captain, satisfied with the bold lie, ordered his ship to sail on into the mist. A single heartbeat's hesitation, a single nervous glance, or a single misplaced lantern glare, and history would have ended right there in the cold, unforgiving waves of the Mediterranean. When they finally touched the white sands of Gulf Juan on March 1st, the real mystery began. Napoleon knew that taking the main roads to Paris would be suicide. The Royalist army would be waiting with heavy cannons and thousands of bayonets. Instead, he made a decision that baffled military minds. He led his men through the treacherous, ice-covered tracks of the Alps. This was a path so steep and dangerous, so vertical and punishing, that it is still known today as the Route Napoleon. They marched through the freezing nights like ghosts in the mountain mist, bypassing fortified cities and moving with a supernatural speed that defied human logic and exhaustion. As they descended from the high peaks, the news began to spread like a devastating wildfire through a dry, parched forest. "The ogre has landed!" the panicked newspapers in Paris screamed in their first editions. But a strange phenomenon began to occur. As he moved further inland, the headlines began to shift, reflecting the changing winds of power. The ogre became the usurper, then he became the general, then the prince, and finally, as he neared the capital, the headlines simply read, "The Emperor." The climax of this haunting psychological journey occurred near the town of Le Fray, at a place now whispered about as the Meadow of the Meeting. A full battalion of the King's 5th Regiment stood blocked in his path, their muskets loaded and leveled directly at his chest. The air was deathly still, the only sound being the cold wind whistling through the mountain valley. No one moved, no one dared to breathe. The commanders of the King's army, desperate and sweating, gave the order to fire. "Aim! Present!" they shouted with cracking voices. But the soldiers' hands trembled. Their eyes met the eyes of the men across the field, their former brothers in arms. Then Napoleon did the unthinkable. He stepped out alone, leaving his own guards far behind, walking slowly and deliberately towards that wall of 1,000 loaded rifles. He stopped just yards away, threw open his famous gray overcoat to bare his chest, and his voice rang out like a crack of thunder that echoed off the mountainsides. "Soldiers of the 5th, if there is one among you who wishes to kill your emperor, here I am. Shoot me now." The silence that followed was agonizing, stretching for what felt like an eternity. A second, 2, 3. Then a roar erupted that could be heard from miles, a sound so primal it shook the very foundations of the French monarchy. "Vive l'Empereur!" The soldiers didn't fire, they wept openly. They broke their ranks, threw down their royalist symbols, and ran forward to embrace the man they were sent to destroy. They weren't just joining an army, they were joining a living legend that had returned from the grave. From that moment on, the march to Paris wasn't a war of blood, it was a ghost story coming to life. Every battalion, every regiment, and every general sent to stop him ended up marching proudly behind him. Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, who had famously promised the king he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, found himself overwhelmed with emotion, falling at his old master's feet in tears of loyalty. King Louis XVIII, hearing the distant rhythmic cheers from the outskirts of the city, didn't even wait for dawn. He fled in the middle of the night, leaving his royal dinner still warm on the table and his crown essentially abandoned. Napoleon walked back into the Tuileries Palace on the shoulders of the screaming, joyous crowds without firing a single shot in anger. He had escaped a guarded island, evaded the world's greatest navy, climbed a frozen mountain range, and conquered an entire kingdom armed nothing more than his presence, his voice, and his legendary name. It remains to this day the greatest gamble in the history of human power. But as he stood alone in the darkened, silent halls of the palace that night, the heavy weight of victory began to settle. The shadows of a distant place called Waterloo were already gathering on the cold horizon. He had won his impossible gamble. He had escaped his golden cage, but he had also set in motion a final tragic act that would change the course of human history and redraft the map of the world forever. As you drift off into a deep and peaceful sleep, let your mind wander back to that moonlit night on the rocky shores of Elba. Think of the man who refused to be forgotten, the leader who turned a firing squad into a welcoming committee, and the sheer, haunting power of a dream that refused to die even in exile. The ghost of France had returned to claim his throne, but as the stars remind us, even the greatest ghosts must eventually face the inevitable dawn. Rest now, and let your dreams take you through the pages of history, for the story of the world is long, and the nights are always full of secrets waiting to be told.